let's return to this dependency grammar framework of looking at language. What's a good justification why the dependency grammar framework is a good way to explain language? What's your intuition?
So the reason I like dependency grammar, as I've said before, is that it's very transparent about its representation of distance between words. So it's like all it is you've got a bunch of words, you're connecting them together to make a sentence. And a really neat insight, which turns out to be true, is that the further apart the pair of words are that you're connecting, the harder it is to do the production, the harder it is to do the comprehension. It's just harder to produce, it's hard to understand when the words are far apart. When they're close together, it's easy to produce and it's easy to comprehend. Let me give you an example, okay? So we have, in any language, we have mostly local connections between words, but they're abstract. The connections are abstract. They're between categories of words. And so you can always make things further apart if you add modification, for example, after a noun. So a noun in English comes before a verb. The subject noun comes before a verb, and then there's an object after, for example. So I can say what I said before, the dog entered the room or something like that. So I can modify dog. If I say something more about dog after it, then what I'm doing is indirectly, I'm lengthening the dependence between dog and entered by adding more stuff to it. So I just make it explicit here. If I say the boy who the cat scratched cried. We're going to have a mean cat here. And so what I've got here is the boy cried. It would be a very short, simple sentence. And I just told you something about the boy, and I told you it was the boy who the cat scratched. Okay.
So the cry is connected to the boy. The cry at the end is connected to the boy in the beginning.
Right. And so I can do that. I can say that. That's a perfectly fine English sentence. And I can say the cat which the dog chased ran away or something. Okay. I can do that. But it's really, but it's really hard now. I've got, whatever I have here, I have the boy who the cat. Now let's say I try to modify cat. Okay. The boy who the cat, which the dog chased, scratched, ran away. Oh my God, that's hard, right? I'm sort of just working that through in my head, how to produce and how to, and it's really very just horrendous to understand. It's not so bad. At least I've got intonation there to sort of mark the boundaries and stuff, but that's really complicated. That's sort of English in a way. I mean, that follows the rules of English. Mm-hmm. But so what's interesting about that is that what I'm doing is nesting dependencies there. I'm putting I've got a subject connected to a verb there, and then I'm modifying that with a clause, another clause, which happens to have a subject and a verb relation. I'm trying to do that again on the second one. And what that does is it lengthens out the dependence. Multiple dependents actually get lengthened out there. The dependencies get longer. On the outside ones get long, and even the ones in between get kind of long. And you just, so what's fascinating is that's bad. That's really horrendous in English. Mm-hmm. But that's horrendous in any language. And so in no matter what language you look at, if you do, just figure out some structure where I'm going to have some modification following some head, which is connected to some later head, and I do it again, it won't be good. It guaranteed. Like 100%, that will be uninterpretable in that language in the same way that was uninterpretable in English.
Just to clarify, the distance of the dependencies is whenever the boy cried, there's a dependence between two words, and then you counting the number of morphemes between them?
That's a good question. I just say words. Your words are morphemes between. We don't know that. Actually, that's a very good question. What is the distance metric? But let's just say it's words, sure.
Okay. So and you're saying the longer the distance of that dependence, the more, no matter the language, except legalese. Even legalese. Okay, we'll talk about it. Okay. But the people will be very upset that speak that language. Not upset, but they'll either not understand it, or they'll be like, their brain will be working in overtime.
Yeah, they'll have a hard time either producing or comprehending it. They might tell you that's not their language. It's sort of the language. I mean, it's following they'll agree with each of those pieces as part of the language, but somehow that combination will be very, very difficult to produce and understand.
Is that a chicken or the egg issue here? So
well, I'm giving you an explanation.
Right.
So I'm giving you two kinds of explanations. I'm telling you that center embedding, that's nesting, those are synonyms for the same concept here. Mm-hmm. And the explanation for why those are always hard. Center embedding and nesting are always hard. And I gave you an explanation for why they might be hard, which is long distance connections. When you do center embedding, when you do nesting, you always have long distance connections between the dependents. And so that's not necessarily the right explanation. It just I can go through reasons why that's probably a good explanation. And it's not really just about one of them. So probably it's a pair of them or something of these dependents that you get long that drives you to like be really confused in that case. And so what the behavioral consequence there, this is kind of methods, like how do we get at this? You could try to do experiments to get people to produce these things. They're going to have a hard time producing them. You can try to do experiments to get them to understand them and see how well they understand them. Can they understand them? Another method you can do is give people partial materials and ask them to complete them. Those center embedded materials, and they'll fail. So I've done that. I've done all these kinds of things.
So wait a minute. So central embedding meaning like you take a normal sentence like the boy cried and inject a bunch of crap in the middle.
Yes.
That separates the boy and the cried.
Yes.
Okay, that's central embedding, and nesting is on top of that.
No, nesting is the same thing. Center embedding, those are totally equivalent terms. I'm sorry, I sometimes use one and sometimes use the other.
Got it.
They don't
totally
mean anything different.
Got it. And then what you're saying is there's a bunch of different kinds of experiments you can do. I mean, I like the understanding one is like have more embedding, more central embedding. Is it easier or harder to understand? But then you have to measure the level of understanding, I guess.
Yeah, you could. I mean, there's multiple ways to do that. I mean, there's the simplest way is just ask people how good does it sound? How natural is the sound? That's a very blunt but very good measure. If it's very, very reliable, people will do the same thing. And so it's like, I don't know what it means exactly, but it's doing something such that we're measuring something about the confusion, the difficulty associated with those.
And those are giving you a signal. That's why you can say them. Okay.
Yeah, very
what,
strong.
what about the completion of this with the central embedding?
So if you give them a partial sentence, say the book which the author who, and I ask you to now finish that off for me. I mean, either say it, but you can just say it's written in front of you, and you can just type and have as much time as you want. They will, even though that one's not too hard, right? So if I say it's like the book, it's like the book which the author who I met wrote was good. That's a very simple completion for that. If I give that completion online somewhere to a crowdsourcing platform and ask people to complete that, they will miss off of a verb very regularly, like half the time, maybe 2/3 of the time. They'll just leave off one of those verb phrases, even with that simple. So say the book, which the author who, and they'll say was. They won't have. You need 3 verbs, right? I need 3 verbs here. Who I met, wrote, was good, and they'll give me 2. They'll say who was famous was good or something like that. They'll just give me 2, and that'll happen about 60% of the time. So 40%, maybe 30, they'll do it correctly. Correctly meaning they'll do with 3 verb phrases. I don't know what's correct or not. This is hard. It's a hard task.
Yeah, I'm struggling with it in my head.
Yeah, well, it's easier
when you stare at it.
If you look, it's a little easier than listening is pretty tough because there's no trace of it. You have to remember the words that I'm saying, which is very hard auditorily. We wouldn't do it this way. You do it written. You can look at it and figure it out. It's easier in many dimensions in some ways, depending on the person. It's easier to gather written data most sort of I work in psycholinguistics, right? Psychology of language and stuff. And so a lot of our work is based on written stuff because it's so easy to gather data from people doing written kinds of tasks. Spoken tasks are just more complicated to administer and analyze because people do weird things when they speak, and it's harder to analyze what they do. But they generally point to the same kinds of things.
So the universal theory of language, by Ted Gibson, is that you can form dependency. You can form trees from any sentences, and
that's right.
You can measure the distance in some way of those dependencies, and then you can say that most languages have very short dependencies.
All languages have short dependencies. You can actually measure that. So an ex-student of mine, this guy is at University of California, Irvine, Richard Futrell, did a thing a bunch of years ago now, where he looked at all the languages we could look at, which was about 40 initially, and now I think there's about 60 for which there are dependency structures. So they're meaning there's got to be like a big bunch of texts which have been parsed for their dependency structures, and there's about 60 of those which have been parsed that way. And for all of those, you can. What he did was take any sentence in one of those languages, and you can do the dependency structure, and then start at the root. We're talking about dependency structures. That's pretty easy now, and he's trying to figure out what a control way you might say the same sentence is in that language. And so what he is just like, all right, there's a root, and it has, let's say as a sentence is, let's go back to, 2 dogs entered the room. And so entered is the root, and entered has 2 dependents. It's got dogs and it has room. Okay. And what he does is like, let's scramble that order. That's 3 things, the root and the head and the 2 dependents, and into some random order, just random. And then just do that for all the dependents down the 2. So now do it for the and whatever was 2 in dogs and for and room. And that's, it's a very short sentence. When sentences get longer and you have more dependents, there's more scrambling that's possible. And what he found was that's one, you can figure out one scrambling for that sentence. He did this like 100 times for every sentence in every one of these texts, every corpus. And then he just compared the dependency lengths in those random scramblings to what actually happened, what the English or the French or the German was in the original language, or Chinese, or what all these like 60 languages. Okay, and the dependency lengths are always shorter in the real language compared to this kind of a control. And there's another. It's a little more rigid, his control. So the way I described it, you could have crossed dependencies, like by scrambling that way. You could scramble in any way at all. Languages don't do that. They tend not to cross dependencies very much. Like, so the dependency structure, they tend to keep things non-crossed. And there's a technical term, they call that projective, but it's just non-crossed is all that is, projective. And so if you just constrain the scrambling so that it only gives you projective, sort of non-crossed, is the same thing holds. So still human languages are much shorter than this kind of a control. So there's what it means is that we're in every language, we're trying to put things close in relative to this kind of a control. Like it doesn't matter about the word order. Some of these are verb final, some of them are verb medial like English, and some are even verb initial. There are a few languages of the world which have VSO, word order, verb, subject, object languages. I haven't talked about those. It's like 10% of the.
And even in those languages, it's still short dependencies.
Short dependencies is rules.
Okay, so what are some possible explanations for that? For why languages have evolved that way? So that's one of the I suppose disagreements you might have with Chomsky. So you consider the evolution of language in terms of information theory.
Yeah.
And for you, the purpose of language is ease of communication, right, and processing.
That's right. So, I mean, the story here is just about communication. It is just about production, really. It's about ease of production is the story.
When you say production, can you?
Oh, I just mean ease of language production. It's easier for me to say things whenever I'm talking to you. So somehow I'm formulating some idea in my head and I'm putting these words together, and it's easier for me to do that. To say something where the words are closely connected in a dependency, as opposed to separated, like by putting something in between and over again. It's just hard for me to keep that in my head. That's the whole story. Like the story, it's basically, it's like the dependency grammar sort of gives that to you, like just like long is bad, short is good. It's like easier to keep in mind because you have to keep it in mind probably for production, probably matters in comprehension as well. Like also matters in comprehension.
It's on both sides of it, the production and the.
But I would guess it's probably evolved for production. Like it's about producing. It's what's easier for me to say that ends up being easier for you also. That's very hard to disentangle, this idea of who is it for? Is it for me, the speaker, or is it for you, the listener? I mean, part of my language is for you. Like the way I talk to you is going to be different from how I talk to different people. Right? So I'm definitely angling what I'm saying to who I'm saying, right? It's not like I'm just talking the same way to every single person. And so I am sensitive to my audience, but how does that work itself out in the dependency length differences? I don't know. Maybe that's about just the words, that part, which words I select.
My initial intuition is that you optimize language for the audience.
Yeah.
But
it's both.
It's just kind of like messing with my head a little bit to say that some of the optimization might be, maybe the primary objective of the optimization might be the ease of production.
Yeah, we have different senses, I guess. I'm like very selfish. And you're like, I'm
No.
like, I think it's like, it's all about me. I'm like, I'm just doing what's easiest for me
What's
at all
easiest
times.
for me?
I don't want to, I'm like, but I have to, of course, choose the words that I think you're going to know. I'm not going to choose words you don't know. In fact, I'm going to fix that when so there it's about, but maybe for the syntax, for the combinations, it's just about me. I feel like I don't know though. It's very hard to.
Wait. But the purpose of communication is to be understood, is to
Absolutely.
convince others and so
Yes.
on.
Yes.
So like the selfish thing is to be understood.
Okay,
it's about
it's
the
a little
listener.
circular there too. Then okay,
Right. I mean, like
Yeah.
the ease of production
helps
that can
me be understood. Then I don't think it's circular. So I
No,
want
I
what's
think I think the primary objective is to be understood, is about the listener, because otherwise, if you're optimizing for the ease of production, then you're not going to have any of the interesting complexity of language. Like you're trying to
well,
explain.
let's control for what it is I want to say. Like
Right.
I'm saying,
Right.
let's control for the thing, the message. Control for the message.
But that means the message needs to be understood. That's the goal.
Oh, but that's the meaning. So I'm still talking about the form.
The form.
Just the form of the meaning. How do I frame the form of the meaning is all I'm talking about. You're talking about a harder thing, I think. Is like, how am I like trying to change the meaning? Let's keep the meaning constant. Like
Got it.
If you keep the meaning constant, how can I phrase whatever it is I need to say? Like I got to pick the right words, and I'm going to pick the order so that it's easy for me. That's what I think is probably like.
I think I'm still tying meaning and form together in my head.
Mm-hmm.
But you're saying if you keep the meaning of what you're saying constant, what the optimization? Yeah, it could be the primary objective of that optimization is for production. That's interesting. I'm struggling to keep constant the meaning. It's just so. I mean, I'm a human, right? So for me, the form, without having introspected on this, the form and the meaning are tied together, like deeply, because I'm a human. Like for me, when I'm speaking, because I haven't thought about language, like in a rigorous way about the form of language.
But look, for any event, there's an unbounded. I don't want to say infinite, but sort of ways that I might communicate that same event. This 2 dogs entered a room. I can say in many, many different ways. I can say, "Hey, there's 2 dogs. They entered the room. Hey, the room was entered by something. The thing that was entered was 2 dogs." I mean, it's kind of awkward and weird and stuff. But those are all similar messages with different forms, but different ways I might frame. And of course, I use the same words there all the time. I could have referred to the dogs as, a Dalmatian and a poodle or something. I could have been more specific or less specific about what they are. And I could have been more abstract about the number. There's I'm trying to keep the meaning, which is this event, constant. And then how am I going to describe that to get that to you? It kind of depends on what you need to know, right? And what I think you need to know. But I'm like trying to let's control for all that stuff and not and it's like I'm just like choosing I'm doing something simpler than you're doing, which is just forms.
Yes.
Just words.
So to you specifying the species, the breed of dog and whether they're cute or not is changing the meaning.
That might be, yeah. That would be changing. Oh, that would be changing the meaning for sure.
Right. So you're just yeah. Well, yeah.
That's changing the meaning. But say even if we keep that constant, we can still talk about what's easy or hard for me, right? The listener and the right. I can talk about which phrase structures I use, which combinations, which
This is so fascinating and just like a really powerful window into human language. But I wonder still throughout this how vast the gap between meaning and form. I just have this like maybe romanticized notion that they're close together, that they evolve close, like hand in hand, that you can't just simply optimize for one without the other being in the room with us. Like it's kind of like an iceberg. Form is the tip of the iceberg, and the rest, the meaning is the iceberg. But you can't like separate.
But I think that's why these large language models are so successful, is because they're good at form, and form isn't that hard in some sense. And meaning is tough still, and that's why they don't understand what they're doing. We're going to talk about that later, maybe, but like we can distinguish. Forget about large language models, like humans, maybe you'll talk about that later too, is like the difference between language, which is a communication system, and thinking, which is meaning. So language is a communication system for the meaning. It's not the meaning. And so that's why, and there's a lot of interesting evidence we can talk about relevant to that.